The Senate chamber was supposed to be routine, another policy debate destined to fade into the endless noise of Washington. But that night, the air was charged. Patty Murray, the long-standing senator with decades under her belt, leaned forward, her voice rising in clipped authority. "Congresswoman Crockett, what you lack is experience. Governing requires years of wisdom, not sound bites from the floor." Her tone wasn't just stern, it dripped with condescension, as if seniority itself was a weapon to silence a younger voice. The cameras caught it all, the pointed finger, the tight smile, the heavy sighs of a politician used to being unchallenged. For a moment, it seemed Murray had commanded the room. A hush followed her tirade, the kind of silence that expects agreement, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She waited, composed, her eyes steady on the senator. No raised voice, no defensive flurry, just patience, the kind that unnerves opponents more than shouting ever could. And then, with the chamber hanging on her next words, Crockett leaned slightly forward and asked one simple question. "Senator, if decades of experience are the measure of wisdom, why do so many of your bills still sit in failure?" The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed from the audience gallery, aides shifted in their seats, and even the presiding chair seemed momentarily frozen. Murray blinked, caught off guard. Her practiced rhythm broken in an instant. It wasn't the volume of Crockett's voice that struck the blow. It was the precision, the calm refusal to play by the old rules of deference. One question had stripped away the facade of authority, and the chamber felt it. This wasn't just about seniority. It was about a deeper battle, truth colliding with spin. And a new generation demanding answers, long buried under political tradition. And as the cameras kept rolling, the weight of Crockett's words began to sink in. This was no ordinary exchange. It was the spark of something larger, something that would ripple far beyond that chamber. But the fallout from that moment would rock. Washington Patty Murray wasn't just another senator. She was a fixture of Washington, a name that had weathered decades of elections, committee hearings, and backroom deals. For years, she had been called the establishment's steady hand, a voice of experience who leaned on seniority as proof of credibility. In her world, time in office equaled authority, and authority equaled truth. But that night, something cracked in the old order. Murray's lecture to Jasmine Crockett wasn't merely an exchange of words. It was a public attempt to reassert that order, to remind the chamber that the hierarchy of Washington still mattered. Yet the silence that followed Crockett's sharp counter-question exposed the vulnerability behind that facade. Why did it matter so much? Because this wasn't about one senator sparring with one congresswoman. It was about who gets to decide. What credibility looks like in American politics? Is it measured in years served, or in the courage to speak truth to power? Is it the accumulation of titles, or the willingness to challenge a broken system? Crockett embodied the outsiders. Defiance. Younger, fresher, unapologetically direct, she represented the very change that establishment figures like Murray had always promised but rarely delivered. Her calm rebuttal wasn't just a defense of her own legitimacy. It was a signal, too. Millions watching that experience without results was no shield against accountability. Almost instantly, the moment leaped beyond the chamber walls. Clips hit Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube within minutes. Hashtags ignited. Hashtag Patty Meltdown and hashtag Crockett.com surged onto trending lists. Commenters replayed the exchange, dissecting the pause before Crockett spoke, the stunned look on Murray's face, the unmistakable power shift. Memes spread like wildfire, one side mocking Murray's decades of experience, the other praising Crockett's surgical precision. Cable news anchors scrambled to frame it. Some defended Murray as a seasoned voice unfairly attacked. Others declared Crockett the clear victor, calling her response a masterclass in composure. But no matter the spin, one fact was undeniable. A freshman congresswoman had just shaken the image of a senior senator on live television, and behind the buzz was something even deeper. A generational battle over America's political soul. Murray's authority represented continuity, tradition, the old guard clinging to relevance. Crockett's poise represented disruption, progress, and a refusal to bow. The clash was more than personal. It was symbolic of America's broader struggle between the establishment and the rising voices, demanding change. Narrator: this wasn't just two lawmakers clashing, it was a generational battle over America's future. But the story wasn't finished. Because just when Patty Murray thought she had steadied herself, just when it seemed her seniority would shield her from the fallout, Jasmine Crockett flipped the script. For decades, Patty Murray built her brand around a single word: experience. In Washington, she was introduced as the reliable veteran, the senator who had seen it all, weathered every storm, and kept the wheels of the Senate turning. Her supporters called her steady, pragmatic, and seasoned. To the press, she was the voice of experience. But behind that polished reputation, another story lingered, one of compromises that dulled conviction, of promises repeated but rarely fulfilled, of a career more defined by survival than transformation. Murray entered politics as a so-called mom in tennis shoes. A relatable every woman who promised to shake up Washington. Yet over time, she didn't break the mold. She blended into it. Instead of dismantling the establishment, she became one of its most reliable defenders. Her rise through the ranks was paved with deals made behind closed doors, gay alliances forged not around bold vision but around calculated survival. Her tenure saw countless bills introduced with fanfare, only to die quietly in committee. Ambitious reforms were diluted into half measures. Lofty speeches about fixing America's schools, lowering drug prices, reining in corporate greed, often collapsed into watered-down compromises that satisfied no one but lobbyists. Voters back home learned to brace themselves for disappointment. Murray would promise change, but Washington would win. Worse still were the contradictions. Flashbacks pepper her career, moments when her words today clashed with her votes yesterday. She once condemned excessive defense spending, yet later supported bloated Pentagon budgets. She called herself a champion of working families, yet sided with corporate interests on trade agreements that devastated manufacturing towns. Sound bites that once drew applause now replay like relics of a politician who said one thing and did another. Over time, Murray's tone changed too. Once eager to listen, she grew dismissive of challengers. Once open to debate, she leaned on her title as a weapon, waving off critics with a refrain of, "I've been here longer, I know better." That arrogance calcified into her public persona. A senator who expected deference simply because of her tenure. Too many. Murray came to symbolize Washington itself, entrenched, immovable, weighed down by decades of inertia. While newer lawmakers surged into office on waves of activism and urgency, Murray embodied gridlock, the comfort of doing things the way they've always been done. She defended the institution more fiercely than the people it was supposed to serve. And it wasn't just perception. Murray's so-called victories often rang hollow. A budget compromise here, a committee chairmanship there. But where was the bold reform she promised when she first ran? Schools still underfunded. Healthcare still unaffordable. Prescription drug prices still soaring. Time after time, Murray chose incrementalism, and time after time, ordinary people bore the cost. That is why her confrontation with Jasmine Crockett mattered so deeply. It wasn't just one senator trying to put a newcomer in her place. It was the establishment itself lecturing the future, insisting that age and tenure outweighed urgency and truth. Murray's raised voice carried not just her words, but decades of entitlement. The belief that because she had survived the system, she owned it. But there was a fatal flaw in her defense. Experience can be a strength, yes, but when wielded as arrogance, it becomes brittle. Murray leaned on her history as a shield, but that shield was riddled with cracks, failed bills, contradictions, compromises that left scars on communities she claimed to fight for. Her career told the story of a politician who had mastered endurance but lost touch with transformation. Narrator for years. Murray leaned on experience as her shield, but that shield was about to crack. Because this time, Patty Murray wasn't up against a deferential newcomer eager to prove herself. She wasn't facing a rookie willing to bow before the hierarchy. She was up against Jasmine Crockett, a challenger who wasn't intimidated, who carried with her the urgency of a new generation, and who was more than ready to pierce through the armor of experience with the sharp edge of truth. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin in the marble halls of Washington, nor in the corridors of elite universities where so many senators cut their teeth. It began in neighborhoods where justice wasn't abstract policy, but the difference between survival and despair. Before she was a congresswoman, before the cameras and headlines, Crockett was an attorney who chose cases that others wouldn't, touched the ones that demanded grit, courage, and a refusal to back down. Her career as a civil rights attorney was forged in the trenches. She stood beside families who had been ignored by the system, clients whose voices were drowned out by bureaucracy and indifference. She wasn't billing hours for corporate firms or chasing prestige. She was defending tenants facing unlawful evictions, fighting against voter suppression, and taking on cases that exposed her to threats but also revealed her unwavering spirit. For Crockett, the courtroom wasn't a place for theatrics. It was where dignity and justice hung in the balance. It was here that she sharpened her skills, her ability to listen deeply, to parse through noise and spotlight truth with surgical clarity. While establishment politicians like Murray leaned on decades of tenure, Crockett built credibility the hard way, through lived experience, through showing up when it mattered most, through becoming a protector for those who felt invisible. Her activism wasn't separate from her identity. It was intertwined. As a black woman in America, Crockett understood what it meant to be underestimated, dismissed, and told to wait her turn. That very underestimation became her power. She leaned into her pride, refusing to conform to a system designed to keep her quiet. Every courtroom battle, every community fight, every rally she joined wasn't just professional experience. It was a statement that justice isn't given, it's demanded. Unlike Murray, who measured her worth by seniority, Crockett's authority came from authenticity. She wasn't speaking from talking points drafted by staffers. She spoke from scars, from struggle, from hard-earned victories. Her rise to Congress wasn't handed to her by party machinery. It was fueled by grassroots movements that saw in her a leader who reflected their own lives. Stories about her spread quickly through communities. Of the attorney who would drive across town late at night to meet a scared client, of the activist who stood on the courthouse steps after losing a case and promised, "We'll be back." She carried those same values into politics: resilience, empathy, and a refusal to be silenced by power. And unlike those entrenched in Washington's club of insiders, Crockett carried no illusions about how the system worked. She knew it was rigged against ordinary people, and she knew it took courage, not just connections, to change it. That's why her presence in Congress struck such a chord. She wasn't just another face in a sea of lawmakers. She was a reminder of what representation should look like. Someone who had walked the walk, lived the struggle, and now stood in the halls of power as a voice for those too often ignored. Narrator. This wasn't just another congresswoman. This was the voice of a new generation, grounded in struggle and truth. The contrast with Patty Murray couldn't have been sharper. While Murray's authority rested on years in office and insider status, Crockett's came from credibility no seniority could buy. Murray talked about experience in terms of committee chairs and legislative calendars. Crockett spoke about experience as the lived reality of fighting for justice in neighborhoods, courtrooms, and on the front lines of America's most pressing struggles. And that contrast is exactly what made their clash electric. Murray tried to weaponize hierarchy. Crockett embodied authenticity. Murray raised her voice. Crockett raised the truth. Every time Murray leaned on her decades in Washington, Crockett could counter with the receipts. Stories of parents mourning gun violence victims, of communities fighting voter suppression, of young people saddled with crushing debt. Every anecdote was a mirror held up to Murray's failures, proof that experience without results was just empty rhetoric. And so, when Patty Murray came swinging in that debate, it wasn't the first time Crockett had faced down authority. She had spent her entire life challenging systems stacked against her and those she represented. She knew how to stay calm when someone in power tried to intimidate her, how to let arrogance burn itself out before answering with a single cutting truth. The moment was inevitable. An establishment senator armed with seniority versus a freshman. Congresswoman armed with authenticity? One believed she had earned the right to lecture. The other carried the receipts that would expose the hollowness of those lectures. Cliffhanger. And when Murray came swinging, Crockett had the receipts. The air in the studio was charged, the kind of electricity that precedes a thunderstorm. Patty Murray leaned forward in her chair, her voice rising as though volume alone could establish authority. Her tone sharpened, almost mocking, as she jabbed at Jasmine Crockett. Maybe, Congresswoman, if you had a little more experience, you'd understand how Washington really works. The words hung heavy, cutting not only at Crockett but at every younger, fresher voice that had ever been told to wait their turn. Murray smirked as if she had landed the decisive blow. For a brief moment, the silence suggested she might have, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. It didn't rush. She let the senior senator's words echo into the stillness, as though weighing them in real time before offering her response. The anchors froze in their seats, eyes darting between the two women. In the audience there was a nervous shuffle, a whispered anticipation of what might come next. Then, with composure that was both deliberate and devastating, Crockett leaned slightly forward and spoke. Her tone was calm, but every syllable carried the weight of conviction. Senator, if experience means decades of broken promises and bills that never delivered for the people you claim to serve, then maybe you're right. I don't have that kind of experience. What I do have is the experience of fighting for families who can't afford to wait any longer. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Heads turned. Murray's smile faltered, her grip tightening on the table as though bracing herself. She tried to interject, but her voice cracked ever so slightly. Betraying the unease behind her practiced bravado, Crockett pressed on. Her calmness, now a sharp contrast to Murray's unraveling composure. You talk about knowing how Washington works, Senator. That's exactly the problem. Washington works for itself, not for the parents working 2 jobs, not for the kids drowning in debt, not for the families burying loved ones because Congress can't summon the courage to act. That's the system you're defending when you lecture me about experience. The anchors shifted in their seats. One of them, lips parted as if to speak, thought better of it. No one dared interrupt. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, the silence between words thicker. Murray leaned back, her voice now strained, defensive rather than commanding. You don't understand how complex this is, Congresswoman. Don't just snap your fingers and change things. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her reply was steady, measured, and lethal. Senator, people aren't asking for finger snapping. They're asking for courage. And if you need 3 decades in Washington to find yours, then maybe it's not experience you're offering, it's excuses. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by a stunned hush. Even the cameras seemed to linger on Murray's face, capturing the flush that crept across her cheeks. She opened her mouth as if to fire back, but no words came. Her hands shifted nervously, her eyes darting to the anchors for refuge, but none came. Narrator. Everyone watching could feel it. The balance was shifting. The old guard's authority was slipping, replaced by the clarity of a voice that couldn't be rattled. And then, as the tension peaked, Jasmine Crockett delivered the line that turned the debate upside down. Cliffhanger. Because in that moment, she didn't just challenge Patty Murray's claim to experience, she shattered it with truth the entire nation could feel. The studio air grew heavy, the way it does when the tide has turned but no one dares to name it yet. Patty Murray sat rigid in her chair, shoulders taut, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though force alone could stop the unraveling.
Oh.
But Jasmine Crockett saw the opening. She didn't hesitate. With calm precision, Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice carrying the steel of truth wrapped in velvet restraint. Senator, you've had 30 years in Washington, 30 years to prove what that experience is worth. Let's talk about it. The studio froze. Cameras zoomed in closer. Crockett's words weren't just directed at Murray, they were. For every viewer at home, every voter tired of promises deferred, you've sponsored bills on child care, on education, on health. And yet, What happened to them? Most died in committee. Some were stripped to the bone until they were unrecognizable. Others passed, but delivered crumbs instead of change. And now you stand here lecturing me about experience? The silence was deafening. Murray's eyes flickered, a faint twitch betraying the unease she tried desperately to suppress. Crockett didn't relent. Experience without results, she said. Pausing just long enough for the weight of the words to sink in, is just time wasted. And Senator, our communities don't have time left to waste. Gasps rippled through the audience. The anchors exchanged stunned glances, their polished smiles briefly faltering. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered, "Clip that line." They knew they had just witnessed the viral moment, the phrase destined to explode across timelines, screens, and headlines. Murray shifted uncomfortably. She raised her hand slightly, as if to interject, but Crockett pressed forward, her voice firm, unyielding. "Tell the single mother in Minnesota who works 2 jobs just to afford childcare that your decades of experience mean something. Tell the students drowning in debt that 30 years of gridlock is their fault for being too young to understand." Washington. Tell grieving parents whose children didn't come home from school that your experience is more valuable than their loss. Go ahead, Senator, tell them. The weight of her words crushed the oxygen out of the room. Murray's jaw worked silently, but no response came. Her practiced authority, the shield of her tenure, crumbled before the audience's eyes. Crockett delivered the final strike with devastating calm. You don't measure a leader by how long they've occupied a seat. You measure them by what they've done with it. And when I look at your record, I don't see leadership. I see a chair left warm, but cold to the people who needed you most. Studio erupted, not with noise, but with a kind of stunned energy. The crowd, once hushed, burst into applause. Cheers spilling over as if years of pent-up frustration had finally found a voice. Online clips were already being cut, tweets already drafted, hashtags already taking flight. Murray sat back, her face flushed, her eyes darting to the anchors for rescue. But there was no lifeline left. The authority she once wielded with ease had evaporated, stripped away by the sharp edge of truth. Narrator. It wasn't just a counter-argument. It was the unraveling of an establishment myth. For decades, experience had been wielded as a weapon, a way to silence the young, the fresh, the uninitiated. But Jasmine Crockett had just exposed it for what it really was, a hollow shield. The anchors tried to move forward, fumbling for the next question, but the debate had already shifted. The audience's eyes weren't on the moderators anymore. They were locked on Crockett, her steady posture, her measured breath. The calm authority that came not from decades in office, but from conviction unshaken. Murray, once the embodiment of Washington's establishment power, now seemed small beneath the lights. Her attempt to reassert herself came off brittle, her words stammered and defensive. The cameras, merciless in their honesty, caught every flicker of discomfort, every falter in tone, and as the show moved to break, the real storm was already brewing beyond the studio walls. On Twitter, #experience's failure trended within minutes, spurred by Crockett's brutal line. Memes compared Marie's decades in office to a rusting, clock-ticking, but never moving forward. Side-by-side clips showed Murray's red-faced silence against Crockett's unflinching poise, captioned with, "A single word? Checkmate." Instagram feeds filled with reels of Crockett's sharpest lines. TikTok lit up with edits that set her takedown to dramatic music, drawing millions of views within hours. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist the setup was too perfect. The imagery too rich, and in living rooms, on smartphones, in whispered conversations at coffee shops and classrooms, people repeated the line that had shattered a senator's facade. Experience without results is just time wasted. Murray had come into the debate confident that her seniority was unassailable, her authority untouchable. But Crockett had not just countered her argument, she had flipped the very foundation it rested upon. In a single moment, the hierarchy inverted. The elder stateswoman had been humbled by the newcomer, and the myth of experience was left in ruins. Narrator. For years, Patty Murray leaned on her record, her tenure, her decades as a shield against criticism. But this time, She faced someone who refused to bow, refused to wait her turn, refused to be silenced. And that refusal changed everything. Cliffhanger, but the true explosion came after the cameras stopped rolling when the shockwaves from that exchange spread far beyond the studio and into the heart of Washington itself. The broadcast had ended, but the story was only beginning. Within minutes of the cameras cutting to commercial, the internet caught fire. On Twitter, a single phrase spread like wildfire, #schooled by Crockett, by midnight. It was the #1 trend in the country. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop line flooded every platform. On TikTok, users layered her takedown over dramatic soundtracks. Some paired it with slow-motion edits. Others with flashing captions. Experience without results is just time wasted. On Instagram, reels of the moment racked up millions of views. Each one replayed and reshared with captions like "the establishment just got checked, and this is what real leadership looks like." Memes exploded across the digital landscape. Patty Murray's flustered expression became a template for endless jokes. Her fumbling hands dubbed the Washington Shuffle. Her silence looped in GIFs labeled "when experience runs out." Side-by-side edits contrasted Murray's tense body language with Crockett's calm poise. It's a visual metaphor that said more than words ever could. But it wasn't just online humor. Late-night comedians seized the moment. On The Daily Show, the host quipped Patty Murray said experience matters, and Jasmine Crockett just gave her the experience of a lifetime. On Late Night with Seth Meyers, a segment titled "Schooled in Real Time" drew roaring laughter from the studio audience. Even mainstream political pundits, often cautious about viral trends, admitted the obvious. Crockett had delivered a historic takedown. Celebrities joined the chorus. Actors, musicians, and athletes tweeted their support. One major pop star reposted Crockett's clip with the caption, "This is the energy we need in 2025. Civil rights leaders praised her courage." While grassroots organizers celebrated, the moment is proof that the establishment could be challenged and beaten not by seniority, but by truth. It wasn't long before the ripple effect reached Washington itself. Activist groups began fundraising off Crockett's viral moment, branding it as a rallying cry for generational change. Commentators described it not just as a debate exchange, but as a cultural shift, the kind of moment that crystallizes when old power finally collides with new energy. Narrator. This wasn't just a televised debate, it became a cultural moment, a line in the sand between what politics had been and what it could become. And yet, beneath the laughter, the hashtags, the viral edits, something deeper was forming. The applause wasn't just about Crockett's composure or Murray's stumble. It was about the hunger of millions of Americans who had grown tired of excuses, tired of seniority used as a shield, tired of decades of promises unfulfilled. For them, Crockett's words weren't just a mic drop. They were a release, an affirmation, a declaration of what the next chapter of politics might look like. Cliffhanger, yet beyond the noise. The deeper lesson was about to crystallize, and it would echo far beyond the memes and headlines. In the days that followed, as the storm of reactions settled into something more lasting, Jasmine Crockett seized the moment to reframe the debate. She didn't gloat over Patty Murray's stumble, nor did she reduce the clash to a single viral clip. Instead, she turned it into a teaching moment, one that resonated far beyond the walls of the studio. Crockett reminded America that politics was never supposed to be about how long you've sat in a chair. It was supposed to be about what you do with that seat, about results, service, and the ability to carry the weight of your community's needs with honesty and courage. Years in office, she argued, mean nothing if those years are filled with broken promises and missed opportunities. She flipped the script on Murray's favorite shield, experience, and revealed it for what it was, a hollow authority, useful only as long as no one dares to challenge it. Experience without empathy is empty, Crockett declared. Her voice, measured but piercing. The real leaders are those who serve, not those who lecture. The ones who stand in the fire with their people, not above them. Her words echoed with a universal truth. Dignity and authenticity will always outlast arrogance and bluster. A calm truth-teller standing firm in conviction can shake an empire more deeply than 1,000 boasts about seniority. For millions who watched, Crockett embodied a new model of leadership, not polished in backroom deals, but forged in real struggles rooted in communities and alive with empathy. Narrator. Experience without empathy is empty, but truth backed by conviction changes history. This moment became more than a skirmish between two politicians. It became a parable for a nation divided between old habits and new hope. It wasn't just Murray versus Crockett. It was the establishment versus the grassroots, stale authority versus living authenticity. And in that clash, America glimpsed a path forward, a politics grounded in integrity rather than entitlement. But Crockett knew something vital. This single victory wasn't the end. It wasn't enough to win one debate, one clip, or even one viral news cycle. The forces of arrogance and entrenched power still held enormous sway, and they would regroup. The establishment does not surrender easily, and so Crockett's closing message wasn't celebration, but resolve. This is bigger than me, bigger than Senator Murray, bigger than this one debate, she said. This is about America's soul, and whether we have the courage to build a politics that actually serves the people again. Cliffhanger. And this battle was just one chapter in a much larger fight for America's soul. Patty Murray may have walked into that debate convinced her decades in Washington gave her the upper hand. She raised her voice, wielded her experience like a weapon, and tried to diminish Jasmine Crockett as an outsider who hadn't earned her place. But the reality was undeniable. Patty lectured, and Crockett schooled her with truth. Contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, arrogance wrapped in seniority. On the other, authenticity is sharpened by lived experience. Murray's authority cracked under the weight of its own emptiness, while Crockett's calm conviction stood tall. Once again, America saw that dignity beats condescension and truth beats spin. This is why these moments matter. They're not just entertainment or clips to scroll past. They reveal the deeper fault lines in our politics. Establishment versus grassroots, hollow claims versus genuine service, spectacle versus substance. And each time a leader like Jasmine Crockett stands firm, it brings us closer to the politics we deserve, one rooted in empathy, accountability, and courage. If you believe in that vision, if you want to see more leaders speak truth to power without fear, then you are a part of this movement too. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, add your voice to the growing demand for honesty in our politics. Because when we amplify truth, we weaken arrogance. When we come together, we become unstoppable. And remember, this isn't just about one debate or one viral moment. This is about building a future where leadership is defined not by years in office, but by the integrity of service. Together, we will write the next chapter of America's promise.